All heard of the Kennedy family curse. Like, there's this belief that the descendants of Joe Kennedy Sr. are cursed. In fact, with that family, of Rose and Joe's 9 children, 4 of them actually died before the age of 50. What if I told you I think the family of Martin Luther King Jr. could be cursed as well?
I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promise.
From Martin Luther King Jr.'s shocking assassination in 1968 to the murder of his mother just 6 years later, this family has a lot of death that seems sometimes too eerie to believe. But is it truly a curse or just a series of tragic coincidences? I don't know, but here's the truth behind the King family curse. I don't know if a lot of people know this, but the family of Martin Luther King Jr. is really low-key like a religious dynasty. And this religious dynasty dates all the way back to slavery. So his great-grandfather was Willis Williams, and he was married at the time to his great-grandmother, Lucretia Williams. The Williams were enslaved on the Williams plantation in Greene County, Georgia. Willis Williams was actually a minister during this time, which was really cool because since he was a slave, he couldn't actively preach in the church. Now, I don't know what that really means, but I'm guessing it means that he couldn't preach in front of white people or that he couldn't create a congregation. Either way, it's still really cool that he was a minister during this time. Then in 1863, Lucretia gives birth to their son, A.D. Williams. Mr. Williams dies in 1874, and the family later moves to Atlanta sometime around 1893. Now, during this time, A.D. Williams wants to follow in his father's footsteps and become a preacher just like his dad was. And so while they are in Atlanta, he does actively go towards preaching and becoming of the ministry. And it's while he's in Atlanta that he meets his future wife, Jeannie Parks, who later becomes Jeannie Parks Williams, and these two have a knot in 1899. The couple will later give birth to their only child, which was Alberta, and she was born in 1904. So Alberta would later marry the assistant pastor at her dad's church, and that was Martin Luther King Sr. And those two tied the knot in 1926. The couple had 3 children in 4 years. A daughter, Willie Christine, she was born in 1927. Martin was born in 1929, and their youngest son, Alfred Daniel Williams King, who was born in 1930. But it's in 1931 where these tragic early deaths start to happen in the King family. So the year is 1931, and Reverend Adam Daniel Williams is the pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church. So Reverend Williams is playing with his granddaughter, Christine, just like any other day. But suddenly, out of nowhere, while he's playing with his granddaughter, Reverend Williams has a heart attack and dies right there. And Reverend Williams was only 68 at the time of his death. Just 10 years later, in 1941, Martin's grandmother, Jeannie Williams, meets a similar fate as her husband. So on this Sunday, Jeannie Williams is at church, and she is attending a women's movement. And I believe she was scheduled to give a speech, not really sure. And while she's at church, out of nowhere, again, just like her husband, she has a heart attack. And while they are transporting her to the hospital, she dies. Martin Luther King Sr. once later told people that Martin and his grandmother were super close, and Martin was so devastated by the loss of his grandmother. He said that Martin was so devastated that he actually jumped out of the second floor window of their home because he was just so saddened by the loss of his beloved grandmother. As we all know, luckily for Martin, he was uninjured, but it just goes to show how close the two of them were, and he was really upset about her early death. But the most devastating loss to the King family came in 1968. In 1968, at this point, Martin Luther King Jr. had literally become an icon and the voice of the civil rights movement. Everyone knew him, even around the entire world. But all of this came to a tragic and horrific end. On April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. is in Memphis, Tennessee, and he's there to help organize the Poor People's Campaign. Now, something interesting about his assassination that I didn't know until I did research was he was actually in Memphis before for a similar cause, but it erupted in violence and a 16-year-old was actually killed. And so Martin still wanted to help. And of course, that's why he was in Memphis in 1968. But I also don't know if a lot of people know this, but the FBI knew King was in Memphis, and so did the local police. So much so, like, they were literally across the street from the hotel where Martin stayed at. Now, we all know how shady J. Edgar Hoover was, so I'm assuming he was just trying to keep tabs. Or could it be something else? I don't know.
All we say to America is be true to what you said on paper. If I lived in China or even Russia or any totalitarian country, maybe I could understand some of these illegal injunctions. Maybe I could understand the denial of certain basic First Amendment privileges because they haven't committed themselves to that over there. But somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly. Somewhere I read of the freedom of speech. Somewhere I read of the freedom of press. Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest far right. And so just as I say we aren't going to let any dogs or water hoses turn us around, we aren't going to let any injunction turn us around. Well, I don't know what will happen now. We've got some difficult days ahead. But it really doesn't matter with me now because I've been to the mountaintop. I don't mind. Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will. And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. And I've looked over and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
We have information that King has been shot at the Lorraine.
Good evening. Dr. Martin Luther King, the apostle of nonviolence in the civil rights movement, has been shot to death in Memphis, Tennessee. Police have issued an all-points bulletin for a well-dressed young white man seen running from the scene.
He is quickly rushed to St. Joseph's Hospital, and unfortunately, Martin was pronounced dead at 7:05 p.m. James Earl Ray was later convicted of King's murder, but even to this day, the King family believes the U.S. government played a major role in King's assassination. But literally, the following year, the King family is hit with yet another tragic loss. A.D. Williams King is the younger brother of Martin, and a lot of people assumed that he would take over after Martin's death. But A.D. was not really interested in doing so. He was already pastoring 4 churches, and he's credited with organizing the Birmingham and Louisville civil rights activities. So he was already doing a lot, and I'm assuming that's why he didn't want to take over at the different organizations after Martin's death. And in the year after his brother's death, although he was reluctant, AD's star was still on the rise. But that also comes to a tragic end. On July 21st, 1969, literally just 9 days before he would turn 39, AD was found drowned in the swimming pool at his home. His cause of death was listed as accidental drowning, and investigators later ruled that there was no evidence of foul play in his death. It is likely that while swimming, the stress of his brother's high-profile activist work and the trauma of his assassination exacerbated AD's heart problems and caused his heart attack. And I never knew this until I did my research, but if you look at a lot of pictures, AD always traveled with his brother. And AD was with his brother in Memphis on April 4th, 1968. I don't think he saw his brother got shot, but he was there when his brother was shot in that same hotel. But literally, AD was in the room directly beneath Martin at the hotel when he heard the gun blast go off. And AD saw his brother lying mortally wounded, and he was just so, I don't even know the words, I just can't even imagine, but he was just so out of it that he had to be restrained by others due to the shock and overwhelming emotion that he was experiencing. But AD's death would mark another tragic turning point in the King family tree, because later on, 3 of AD's children, his father and his niece, would all die of heart attacks at a young age. But their family couldn't catch a break, because in 1974, their mother, Alberta King, always known as Mama King, meets the same violent fate as her famous son. It was a typical Sunday morning. They gathered at Ebenezer Baptist Church. Mama King, in which she always was at the church organ, enjoying these moments of worship and peace. A 23-year-old from Ohio burst into the church and stood up and yelled, "You are serving a false god," and fired his gun. Marcus Wayne Chenault fired 3 shots. 1 bullet struck Alberta King, another hit a church deacon, Edward Boykin, and did not survive as well. Mama King was transported to Greater Memorial, but died shortly afterward from a gunshot wound to the right of her head. Chenault was quickly apprehended, and during his interrogation, he claimed that he acted on divine orders. Chenault said that he shot King because all Christians are my enemies, and he even claimed that Black ministers were a menace to Black people. He told investigators that his original target had been Martin Luther King Sr., but he had decided to shoot his wife instead because she was closer to him. Chenault was later diagnosed with a severe mental illness. Even though this was the case, he was still sentenced to death. The world really didn't know how to treat or how to sentence people that commit these vicious acts when they are operating under mental illnesses. So later, though, they do change his sentence to life in prison. And Chenault would spend the rest of his days behind bars until his death in 1995. I wish I could stop there, but I can't, because the heartbreak didn't end with Martin Luther King Jr., his siblings, or even his mom. The next generation of the King's family faced their own share of tragedies. In 1976, Esther Darlene King, which was AD's daughter and Martin's niece, decides to head out for a jog in her neighborhood. So while Darlene is jogging, out of nowhere, she collapses and dies. Darlene was only 30 years old. It is believed that she also died of a sudden heart attack, just like her dad. Then in 1986, tragedy struck again because Sweet Al King, who was the oldest son of AD, also dies at a young age. And here's the weird part. He literally dies the same exact way as his younger sister. So Al is taking a normal jog in his neighborhood, and while he's jogging, he collapses and dies, what is later believed to be from a heart attack. A.D. Williams King Jr. was only 36 years old at the time of his death. Then the family was hit with 2 more tragic deaths in just 2 years. In 2007, Yolanda King, who was the eldest daughter of Martin and Coretta, suddenly dies from a heart attack at the young age of only 51. 2 years later, in 2009, A.D. King's youngest son, Vernon, dies unexpectedly, also died from a heart attack. Vernon was also young at just 49 years old. And then more recently in 2024, Dexter King, who was the youngest son of Martin, passed away at just 63 years old after battling prostate cancer. While there is no evidence of a supernatural force at work, the untimely deaths of so many family members, one after another, make it impossible to ignore the chilling similarities. A family that had given so much to the world now has a history filled with pain, loss, and unanswered questions. Despite the tragedy that has struck the King family, their legacy lives on in the work of the King family and their descendants.